When you picture the American West, you probably imagine wild, wide open spaces, right? Well, here's something that might surprise you. About half of all that land is actually owned by the federal government, AKA you, the American people. So how did we end up owning so much of the West? Well, it all goes back to how America grew. Back in the 1800s, we started expanding from the East Coast, buying huge chunks of land, winning territory in wars, taking tribal land by force, and making deals with other countries. The thing is, when we acquired all this Western land, there weren't any states to take ownership. So the federal government had to manage millions and millions of acres. It created an agency called the General Land Office to survey, give away, and sell off these massive territories.
I think a lot of people are familiar with the idea of homesteading. So that was a way a lot of lands were disposed of that had been formerly federal. Also grants to railroads, also land grants to states as they entered statehood, withdrawals of lands for military bases, also the creation of national forests and national parks. Those all came then out of what was formerly public lands.
Congress passed the Homestead Act in 1862, basically saying, hey, if you want free land, come west, live on it, and farm it. But a lot of Western land wasn't exactly prime real estate. Too dry for farming, too remote, or too mountainous. Many homesteading claims failed when settlers discovered they couldn't make a living. The federal government ended up holding on to land nobody wanted, or nobody could successfully settle. By the 1930s, homesteading was essentially over.
I think there's three reasons. One is the practical matter of the lands that are left by the beginning of the 20th century are regarded as marginal lands, not suitable for farming. Two is there's this longer history of fraud and abuse and misuse of both land as well as land distribution acts, where people say this is not the idea. You know, we're having thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of acres being consolidated into private hands and abused, and that's not right. And then third, by the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, you have this growing movement for conservation, which calls for protecting these lands for the interests of the American people.
And the federal government became responsible for doing that on behalf of Americans.
It's set aside as land managed by the federal government for a variety of different purposes, including forest management, rangeland management. Franklin Roosevelt does a temporary withdrawal of the public lands from further distribution and sale, and that is more or less finalized in 1976 with the Federal Land Policy Management Act.
And that really set the stage for what BLM's mission is, and that included deciding at that point to largely stop the disposal of public lands and retain the remaining lands in federal ownership, and to manage those lands for multiple use, for the use of people today as well as into the future.
And what does multiple use mean exactly?
Well, multiple use includes using public lands for their natural resource values, for wildlife habitat, plant habitat, cultural resources, as well as uses like livestock grazing, forestry, recreation, transmission lines for energy, mineral development.
The Bureau of Land Management was born out of the old General Land Office and the U.S. Grazing Service. Today, the BLM and the Forest Service manage most of the federal land in the West. And here in Idaho, the federal footprint is especially large, with nearly 2/3 of the state owned and managed by the feds. Idaho ranks 4th nationally for land owned by the federal government. While the BLM mostly oversees rangeland, sagebrush steppe, and desert canyons in Idaho, the Forest Service manages mountain forests, alpine peaks, and wilderness areas. The agency also balances multiple uses. In addition to recreation access and wildlife habitat conservation, it manages timber harvest, protects watersheds and wilderness, and manages wildfires. The National Park Service, Fish and Wildlife Service, Bureau of Reclamation, and Department of Defense oversee hundreds of thousands of acres, but have a much smaller footprint. You might be asking, what about state-owned land? Well, state land isn't public land. Are you ready for another history lesson? When Idaho became a state in 1890, the federal government gave Idaho over 3.5 million acres for institutions like public schools and universities.
The federal government gave the state land as a way of providing an ongoing stream of revenue, essentially.
Because the state is constitutionally mandated to make the most money it can for these institutions, Idaho started selling and leasing lands in the early 1900s.
Land that was given to the state is managed for production, for financial return, and in some of those instances they decide that the way to make the most money is to sell it.
Today, the state owns 2.5 million acres of endowment land, just 5% of the state. So over the decades, land was carved up and handed out. Some stayed federal, some went to the new state of Idaho, some went to private hands, all for different reasons, all at different times. The result? Our state looks like a giant checkerboard. Federal forests here, private ranches there, state lands scattered in between. It's a complex legacy of America's westward expansion, one that still shapes how we live, work, and play today.
The state of Idaho has a unique arrangement, almost a checkerboard of different agencies that have ownership and management of different swaths. But how does state land play into all of this? State land like I'm on right now, outside the Boise foothills.
There has been this lack of understanding for years, really since statehood, right? These lands that were granted to the state of Idaho were granted by the federal government starting right around the Civil War.
Dustin Miller is director of the Idaho Department of Lands. He talks lands for a living.
We received a total of 3.6 million acres for the sole purpose of funding the various institutions needed to begin providing services for a new state.
The endowment land, as it's called, still helps to power those services till this day.
The public education system, the state penitentiary system, the state hospital system. And so the focus there was for the states to utilize those endowment lands to produce revenue and manage those natural resources in a way to produce revenue and maximize revenue for the endowment beneficiaries. And 85% of the acres we manage belong to Idaho's public schools.
Particular parcels belong to specific endowments. This interactive map helps to show how it all fits together. The Land Board, made up of Idaho's top officials, provides directions to the Department of Lands in their management of approximately 2.5 million acres of that state trust land. But how does the Idaho Land Board generate money from it? Well, in the beginning, it was selling land as an easy solution.
Land began being sold by the Land Board shortly after statehood and really slowed at about World War II, following World War II. About 1 million acres, 1.1 million acres were divested of, and a lot of those were more of the cropland areas, better fertile farm ground. Those were sold into private ownership, and we retained most of the timberland acres.
Leaders knew that selling all the land would not help future generations, so they got to work on the land, and it continues as we speak.
Sell timber on those lands. On about 1 million acres of what we have right now is timberlands, and that produces about 90% of the revenue for the endowment beneficiaries. We also lease lands for livestock grazing, for communication sites, commercial leasing, mineral leasing, recreational leasing, and other types of leases to produce that revenue. And so they are working lands. They belong to the endowment beneficiaries, but they do not belong to the general public.
But that doesn't mean the general public doesn't get to use them for hikes, bikes, delights.
Managing these lands to produce income, that's paramount. That's the endowment mission. But we're also keeping these lands open for public recreation. But we need to continue to get our message out to inform the public on what the true nature of these lands really is. And they're set aside for a purpose to produce that revenue for the endowments.
Like the trees on the landscape, the Land Board wants to see that money made grow.
That money is sent over to the Endowment Fund Investment Board that manages a $3.5 billion permanent fund for the endowment. So the land and the financial instruments work together to produce those distributions for our endowment beneficiaries.
Not every piece of land that Idaho owns is endowment land. The state has certainly acquired land beyond the initial gift from the government. Idaho Parks and Recreation maintains great places to visit, hike, and camp, and the state still looks to purchase for several purposes.
And in the last 5 years, I think we've acquired more than 50,000 acres of additional timberlands that we've purchased from private timberland owners. And so we are growing the state assets, the state land assets slowly, but we do have a land bank that allows us to use those funds to purchase lands that make sense for us to manage and make sense for us to acquire.
Idaho does sell land in very specific cases, but knows that they can usually maximize endowment land with continued operations that have led to sizable payouts.
Last year, the distribution based off of, again, our work on the land and the work done by the Endowment Fund Investment Board was about $100 million that was doled out to the beneficiaries.
So it can be a complicated conversation for sure, but if you realize you're on state endowment land, the next time you're out and about, you can tell the people you're with it's parcels with a purpose.
What was a California quail.
Being outside, listening to nature.
And I believe I heard a meadowlark.
Feeds Kevin Merrill's soul.
Just listen. Just listen. Oh, it's delightful. And just look. My wife has a serious neurological disease. She has Parkinson's. And I'm one of her caregivers. And if I can get out, focusing deliciously, intently, and completely on something natural, I go back home a better caregiver.
I've mountain biked all over, climbed all over Idaho. You know, it's been my life, my friends.
Scott moved to Boise in his 20s, drawn by the access to public lands.
Being clueless about it, coming from the east, I didn't realize, how amazing it is.
What do public lands mean to you?
Public lands means there's a place I can go without having to pay a premium. Public lands means there is value in the earth and its resources.
But you can get out there and be more remote, and it's amazing.
To me, it's a very American idea.
But across the West, that American ideal is sparking a very American debate about who should decide the future of millions of acres of public land, Washington, D.C., or state capitals. During the budget reconciliation process earlier this year,
and the impact will be to 1/3% of the federal land in the state.
Some Western congressmen tried selling or transferring millions of acres of public land to states or private interests.
Nevada population centers are all encumbered by federal land that can't meet their housing and development needs without disposal of federal land.
The proposals didn't make it into the One Big Beautiful Bill. Most of Idaho's congressmen,
that's just crazy,
and their constituents thought they were a step too far.
Ryan Zinke, the former Secretary of Interior and now Congressman from Montana, and I worked very hard on making sure that we got the wholesale of public lands out of that bill.
But it couldn't happen with the kind of pushback that the people had, and that was a good thing.
They want to fish and hunt, and they want to water ski, and they want to camp, and they want to go out and enjoy this incredible blessing that we have. And they are not in any way ready to give that up.
Land swaps and sales between the feds and states do happen when it makes sense, and have since statehood. But Idahoans on both sides of the aisle share the same worry. Using budget reconciliation for a sweeping sell-off would create a bad precedent, and it would cut the public out of the process.
Exchanges have always been a way to make management more efficient.
But this idea of doing it through Congress,
or just selling it to the highest bidder, everybody, rightfully so, is worried about what's going to happen to their access. Access to public lands in Idaho is sacred.
Making money off public land isn't the federal government's main goal. It tries to balance multiple uses: recreation, logging, grazing, energy and mineral leases, often with public input. But Idaho leaders say Washington could do a better job by preventing more fires, boosting revenue, and cutting the red tape.
Under the National Environmental Policy Act, local people are supposed to have input, and nobody disagrees with that. But there have been a series of lawsuits over the years to where it's just been handcuffs on getting anything done.
So we have to go through the federal government for a lot of approvals to do anything with the federal land.
Representative Russ Fulcher believes the state would do a better job managing federal lands within our borders.
I definitely believe we need to keep the public lands in public hands. I just believe that management responsibility needs to be shifted to the state, needs to be shifted to the local stakeholders. because the current model we're struggling with, and the funding for the Ag Department and the Forest Service and Interior, it's going down, it's not going up.
Idaho's Attorney General agrees. Along with Governor Little, he's one of 5 elected officials on the State Land Board, which oversees the Department of Lands. In a statement to KTVB, Raul Labrador said if Idaho owned the land, the revenue could be reinvested in our own state. Labrador believes, quote, the federal government's overreach undermines our state sovereignty and shortchanges Idaho communities.
There are a lot of unanswered questions as to what that process would look like, the restrictions, the cost, the number of employees that we would need to hire at the Department of Lands to manage.
If Idaho took over federal lands, lawmakers would decide what agency would manage it and how.
At this point, I just don't think we could do it.
Idaho Department of Lands Director Dustin Miller says they couldn't afford to manage all the federal land in the state. They spent $60 million on fire suppression alone last summer, while the Forest Service spent at least 5 times that amount in Idaho.
We've got our lands to manage, 2.5 million acres. That keeps us pretty busy, and we want to continue working in partnership with our federal partners to improve the health and resiliency of federal lands here in Idaho.
While Idahoans can explore most endowment trust lands today, there's no guarantee tomorrow. The state constitution demands one thing of IDL: maximum profit for institutions like schools and prisons.
They are working lands. They belong to the endowment beneficiaries, but they do not belong to the general public.
So conservationists and outdoorsmen worry hand federal lands to the state, and it could end up in private hands, while public voices get shut out of the process.
About 42% of all the lands that the state has ever owned are gone from us. They're in private hands. And when you put something into private hands, you're really permanently closing off public access. And you're just changing the way that all Idahoans interact in these landscapes and the things that really define our lifestyle.
Their lifestyle and their identity.
I go back home with more capacity to love and be compassionate and endlessly patient. And I love being out in nature.
But I would hate to see a big chopping block to a lot of the great resources that are available to the public. It's meant a lot to me. I'm sure there's a lot of people who feel the same way.
You just heard from stakeholders about how difficult it would be to manage state and federal lands within our borders. But what does this specifically mean when it comes to wildfires and fire mitigation? We drove more than 100 miles away from here over to Stanley and looked back at the 2024 wildfire season. How was it handled? What did they learn? And what would this look like if it was in the state's hands to handle it?
Last year on a beautiful day, July 12th, all of a sudden a puff of smoke came up across the lake here at the Bench Lakes.
For Redfish Lake Lodge owners Jeff and Audra Clegg,
It just started to escalate, and there was a helicopter crew that came in. The helicopter unfortunately crashed in the lake, and they had to kind of revamp. And the next day, the Forest Service, because of what was going on, contacted us and said we need to evacuate everybody. So we spent the better part of the day trying to get all the guests off the lake, off the beach.
What unfolded for the next 16 days during their busiest season changed everything. They had to relocate about 100 employees.
It became a really dramatic event. There was just 3 or 4 of us in here, and then all the Forest Service firefighting crew came in.
Fire crews poured in across the west, bringing planes, sprinklers, pumps, and started backburning, giving everything they had to protect the lodge and stop the fire.
Congressman Simpson pulled Audra and I aside and said to us, if we lose Redfish Lake Lodge, it's not because we didn't give it everything we have. And they did. I mean, they literally unleashed all of their facilities.
We felt protected.
Yeah.
We really did feel protected.
But behind this fire line was federal crews, federal dollars, and federal laws. And hypothetically, if these lands were to be handed over to the state, people like Justin Hayes with the Idaho Conservation League say it would come with a price tag that the state isn't ready for.
The state could just never take over that responsibility. If somehow these lands became state lands, the firefighting bill would be about $150 million a year that the state would have to cough up.
Hayes says that would likely come back to the taxpayers.
Communities across Idaho are annually passing levies and bonds trying to pay for the school system around them. What do you think, you're going to have like a levy and a bond to support what was once the national forest but is now a state? No, it's just not going to happen.
He says that dollar figure doesn't even include the cost of fire mitigation. Things like prescribed burns, forest thinning, and building fire breaks to protect communities before a fire starts.
There's a lot of demands put on it, and so it's a lot harder to manage. And the state management framework's just very different. It's much more, we're here to make money, we're doing this one thing. They're not balancing as many competing demands.
Fire mitigation comes with a lot of red tape. Jeff Beeler spent years defending federal agencies in court.
Throughout the West, we've seen some of the most severe fires we've ever experienced.
When you look at the time before a fire starts, Beeler says even small projects like thinning trees require layers of environmental review that slow it down.
The federal government, in order to approve that project, would have to go through a process under the National Environmental Policy Act. It just sort of requires agencies to engage in well-informed decision-making. They have to notify the public, they have to explain the scope of the project, allow for public commentary, and then they need to make sure that they're engaging in sort of the environmental analysis that they need to conduct. It's not easy for the federal government to comply with these statutes. There are regulations that are involved. I mean, it takes time for that to occur.
He says it can take years, even after a priority location is established, to begin the project. And no matter if it's the state or federal government, they have to go through that procedure, and many end up in a court battle from environmental groups, adding to the cost.
It would require a level of investment and a level of management that the state thus far, has not done, right? We've relied primarily on the federal government because it's federal government land. It would be difficult if all of the land were given to the state of Idaho, for example.
Designated wilderness areas are even more difficult to get an approved fire mitigation plan. It's an effort, he says, the federal government takes seriously.
If the forest is not being managed, trees are not being cut down, and there are these massive wildfires, lives could be lost, firefighters could be killed. I mean, there are a number of consequences for that.
Work that Hayes believes the state of Idaho wouldn't want to take on for the added responsibility and cost.
The state of Idaho has a track record of selling lots of land. I mean, 41%, 42% of all the land they've ever owned, they've already sold into private hands. And so if somehow they became the landlords, the owners of the Boise National Forest, they couldn't afford to manage it. And so they would find the parts that they wanted to manage for timber production, and they would sell off the parts that they didn't think were economical to them.
For Redfish Lake Lodge owners, it all comes back to gratitude for the amount of help that stepped in.
We felt a lot of support from the firefighters and the Forest Service during all of that. The communications were excellent. We were, informed all along the way. We attended all the community meetings. And they did an outstanding job of protecting all of our facilities.
And it's the reason they can continue running the iconic lodge today.
We're just so grateful. Everything is here and everything is good. Yeah. We're so grateful.
Nestled in the Sawtooth Valley, at the foot of iconic mountain ranges and rugged wilderness, Stanley's greatest feature is also its greatest barrier.
The city cannot grow, really can't expand outward.
Just look at this map. The city is small compared to the private property around it. That's shown here in white. Zoom out a bit and you'll see the rest of the land surrounding Stanley is federal.
That creates the main problem we have, which is the lack of housing especially for workers to live here.
Stanley Mayor Steve Bottai says nearby private property is too expensive to buy, forcing the city to look at expanding onto federal land to ease the housing crisis.
There's a possibility that we could exchange some land with the Forest Service.
Bottai wants to trade land the city owns a few miles out of town for a plot owned by the Sawtooth National Forest on the western edge of town. There, he hopes the city can build affordable housing units.
The one that we own west of town probably is more valuable to the National Forest Service than it is to the city, because it would be difficult to develop. It has wetlands on it, it's open meadowland. The ecological values are much greater than the parcels that are along a city street.
John Robison with the Idaho Conservation League
I just love talking about public lands.
says Stanley isn't the only community hitting roadblocks with all the federal land around it, especially as Idaho's population grows.
Some of the most popular places for people to visit or people to live in are popular because they border public lands. And that does create some challenges in terms of affordable housing or other issues like that.
He says rules and regulations protect federal land while still allowing communities a way to grow. Many are listed under the Federal Land Policy and Management Act of 1976, which states the public needs to have a say in lands considered for sale, and any sale or exchange must be in the public's best interest.
The real solution to this is how to make sure that communities do more infill, and so really concentrate on working within the boundaries. And if there are parcels of public land, that should be part of the conversation.
That's exactly what the city of Boise is doing, building up, not out.
We see the adjacent public lands really as an asset.
Planning manager Deanna Dupuis says love for the surrounding foothills is why the city's modern zoning code, adopted in 2023, promotes growing up.
We talk to our community. They love having that access to public land and open space around our city. And so we have to make a choice about if we want to protect our open space, we need to grow within our city. Our residents are curious about accommodating our housing needs and want to make sure that we have enough housing. However, we are implementing policy solutions that allow us to do that within our existing footprint.
But Stanley's mayor says increasing density like Boise would ruin the small mountain town's charm. That's why they're banking on the land swap, as well as a new housing project going in just north of town.
That's the desire, is to set it back against that hillside.
The city plans to add 20 townhomes for workers on land Congress gave Stanley in 2015.
Since that time, we've been working on a plan to actually develop it. Has not happened yet, as you can see, but we're getting closer and closer.
Bataille is grateful to have options that make this and future developments possible. But outside of small, unique land deals when it makes sense, he believes public land should stay public.
If we were talking about transferring millions of acres of land or something like that, that's a totally different proposition.